Welcome everyone to KringleCon. I'm super happy to be here at Santa's Castle. This is probably the coldest place I've ever been in for a Floridian. It's even worse. I mean, I had to travel insane distance to get here, and the entire trip was just like treacherous. Like I had to like get on a Viking ship at one point, and it was madness. But anyways, I'm happy to be here. It took forever to get here, but this is amazing. I can't believe we're having a hacker conference at the North Pole. So welcome everyone. I'm your speaker in this room. My name is Beau Bullock, and today I'm going to talk to you about everything you've ever wanted to know about password spraying, but were afraid to ask. So we'll get into what exactly password spraying is in just a moment. But first off, let's talk a little bit about like what are credentials anyway? Like what I mean, if you're coming into this, conference, you probably had to have credentials to even get in here. You probably had to have some sort of password to even get into this place. So credentials are vital. They control access to your account. Whenever you go to a website, you typically have to sign in and use a username and password. And attackers want that password. And when we talk about hacking an organization or hacking a company or hacking Christmas for that matter, we can look at the ability to gain access to credentials as being the first kind of step into completely taking over that organization or company or whatever we're trying to get access to. Now, a lot of people think, okay, well, I'm just this employee at this company. Maybe I'm like, nobody. I'm in accounting. Who would want my credential? What does it matter? Well, whenever we are attacking a company that utilizes Active Directory, which is very often. I would put it in like the 95% of companies that I assess from Black Hills Information Security, from companies that we perform penetration tests against, use Active Directory, which is a Microsoft service, which basically is a directory of usernames and computers, and it helps to kind of combine everything that you want to control within an organization from a computer standpoint. It allows you to push out policies to specific users, that kind of thing. Well, having access to a single credential of an Active Directory account typically gives you a lot more than just access to that user's computer system or to their specific account. Active Directory is vast. So a lot of times we'll get access to a credential and we can access things like file shares on the network, things that a normal user can access that, their credential gives them access to on the network. If, for example, they use something like Office 365, a lot of companies we assess these days are moving to the cloud and using things like Office 365, where now SharePoint and various documents and Outlook, all that stuff is in the cloud. And if I have access to a credential, I can now not only access that user's, let's say their email, but I can also access SharePoint, and a lot of times SharePoint is where companies store a vast amount of information regarding their company. Things like maybe VPN details, internal documents, that kind of thing. I was actually just on an assessment last week where an internal Git repository, which is typically like a source code repository of information internal to this network. Anyone who had a credential on the domain, anyone who had an Active Directory credential could access it. And there was a lot of very sensitive information in that, including access keys to their Amazon AWS account, passwords to a number of different services, and so on. So the point I'm trying to get to here is that having a single credential will allow access to a number of other things and be the next step in the attack. So typically within a Microsoft Active Directory network, your default password policy is a minimum of 8 characters and doesn't include your username. So you're not allowed to set it to your username. And the majority of the time it's set to what they call password complexity, which is 3 of the 4 categories: uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, or non-alphanumeric symbols. And by default, these accounts typically lock out after about 5 attempts within a 30-minute window, so a 30-minute observation window. So what's a password that fits that policy? Well, fall 2018, and we'll kind of get into more details about why that's very key here in a minute. So what are some common password attacks? When we look at hacking an account, brute forcing obviously is one of the first things that comes to mind for most hackers out there. And what that is essentially trying thousands of passwords against one account. So this is kind of problematic when we look at that lockout policy that we mentioned previously, because if we try to thousands of passwords against one account, you're going to lock them out really quick. Another common password attack is password reuse. So if you, for example, were part of a breach or part of if you had your account on a site or service that was breached, your password, your clear text password, might be out there for the world to get. There's services such as Have I Been Pwned that allow you to kind of search for your email address and see if you have been part of a breach. But a lot of times, those breach credentials are just publicly available on various websites, and you know, for an attacker, they can go grab those and then try to reuse them. And if you're using the same password, for example, like your LinkedIn account as you are on your corporate Active Directory account, we might be able to just reuse that password. Credential phishing is another huge topic all of its own. This involves social engineering a target into inputting their creds into a portal that an attacker controls. So I would basically send you a link to, let's say I wanted to phish your Gmail credential. I might set up a portal that looks almost identical to Gmail and then send you a link telling you that you need to log into this. This is a very basic example, but a lot of people get tricked into inputting their credentials into these types of sites. And then password spraying, that's what this talk is all about. So we're gonna get more into the details of that now. So take this picture, for example, of a ton of locks, just, you know, locked against a wall, fence. So, you know, locks are not the perfect example, but this can kind of paint a picture here. So imagine this is an Active Directory environment where each one of these locks kind of symbolizes an account for a user that would log into their network. Now, you know, lock manufacturers a lot of times actually have common keys or key-to-like locks that, you know, if you have one key, you might be able to open multiple locks. So, for example here, let's say that these users or the people that put these locks here could actually choose their own keys, such as the case with passwords. Now, if I chose a key that was relatively easy or something common, I might be able to unlock a lot of these locks. So this is kind of similar to what password spraying is. So with the lockout policies preventing us from brute forcing, we have to think of another way to kind of get around that restriction and somehow get access to an account. Now, what if we tried authenticating using only one password, but against all of those accounts? So let's say we grabbed one key and we tried one key against all of those locks. We might actually get lucky and find that one of those locks just magically opens because it's a common key. So what's going to happen is we're going to generate thousands of failed logins, but they're all single failed logins for each user. So that doesn't actually meet the lockout threshold for a specific user. So for example, if a lockout threshold is set to 5 attempts in 30 minutes, and we only try one attempt per user, we can, you know, try thousands of failed logins because we're trying to log into everyone else's account. We're not trying to log into that one specific account using multiple passwords. We're trying one password. And we might get lucky with something common like season year or company 123 or password year. So season year is perfect in most cases, and it's honestly the most common thing that we find in most organizations because it lines up to the default policy for resetting your password, which is 90 days. So, you know, we find that people are like, oh, I need to reset my password. Let's just try winter 2018 or fall 2018, you know, and then repeat after 90 days, change it to season year. A lot of people do that. And then when we get access to an account, we now have the ability to do those other things that I mentioned earlier, like get access to SharePoint and stuff. So what are some ways we can do this? So internal to a domain, if you have access to a system with an Active Directory account, you can use one of the tools that I wrote called Domain Password Spray, which is a PowerShell script that essentially just performs password spraying against all the users within a domain. Another way to perform password spraying is with Metasploit's SMB login module. And so both of these will essentially create failed logins on the target system. And I've had a number of customers lately who have started to really detect this type of activity. So we started kind of thinking like, what are some ways we can kind of evade using this specific internal domain spray? Well, what if we hit Outlook Web Access? So this is a very common service as well in a lot of organizations. So Microsoft Exchange and Outlook Web Access are very common across a lot of the organizations we assess. one of the tools that I wrote called Mail Sniper has the ability to perform password spraying against OA. And the failed logins look a little bit differently than they do against SMB. I was just on another assessment recently where I used this tool and it did not get detected, whereas the previous tool that I showed you did. So when we look at trying to evade logging, this might be another option. But we've also had a lot of customers who have seen this specific tool and they've started alerting on it as well. So what else can we try against? Well, how about RDP? So Remote Desktop Protocol, which is on by default on most Windows systems. So I tested out using this tool called XFreeRDP, which is actually a Linux tool against a Windows server. And I was just kind of going through the process of trying to figure out if this would maybe evade some logging. And to my surprise, the failed login event didn't actually include the source IP address. The host name was there, but the IP wasn't, which was very odd. So why was there no IP in the log? Well, it turns out that RDP with NLA, which is called Network Layer Authentication, doesn't actually log the source IP to a security log. NLA actually pre-authenticates the user. So like whenever you RDP to a system, you might commonly recognize the prompt that kind of comes up that looks like a traditional like Windows prompt prior to actually getting to the GUI of Windows. That is actually NLA at work. So there's actually supposed to be another log that NLA is supposed to write to in this event, right? So in the event that I fail login using RDP that has NLA, there should be this event 140 failed login event that actually gets logged to whenever somebody fails. But what is really, really misleading about this is that it only fires when the username is invalid. So if I'm using valid usernames with invalid passwords, there is no event ID 140 log. And I've got a quick demo of this to kind of show you how this looks. So to show you here, I've got an attacker system with an IP address of 192.168.88.245. And I'm going to demonstrate using this tool called RDesktop against a Windows Server 2012, where we're going to attempt to log into this dvader account. And we can see that we failed to log in. Now, if we go to look at the actual failed event log now, we will see the username. So we should see dvader as the account name there. And then we also see that we have the unknown username or bad password, and then also the workstation name and the source network address. So that's our attacker IP. So total attribution there. We know exactly who performed a failed login using that tool. And the reason that happened is because our desktop does not use NLA to authenticate. So to kind of show you a proof of concept here, I created a list of host names. So we see like printer1, share1, share5, don't look here. So these are the list of host names that we'll be sending to this system. And then we also have a list of usernames here. And I have a proof of concept Python script, which I'll show you a link to that in a little bit, that basically takes that host list and the user list and then performs a password spray against RDP. And we can see that the CRUD was probably valid. So this means that the actual user's credential FN2187 was actually Spring 2017. That credential was valid, but the user, because they're not an administrator of the system or they're not in the RDP group, they're not actually able to RDP to the system. But now let's go look at the audit failures for these users. So again, we'll see the username. So we'll see that a failed event happened. But if we go look at the workstation name, share5 and no source IP, that's not good for trying to track down who performed this failed login. So imagine now, you're an administrator on this network and you're just seeing these failed logins come from hosts that are already on your network. I could give it a list of your own host names. I can make it look like people are just failing to log in from everywhere. And with no source IP, it gets really difficult. So again, like with NLA, it should log to this other log. But we mentioned before that if we're using valid usernames, then it doesn't actually show up here. So let me get out of this and back over to the presentation. So that's pretty much the rundown for password spraying. And I really hope you guys have a great time here at KringleCon. And if you want to follow me on Twitter at DapTac, and here's a few links to the different tools that I described. So Mail Sniper, domain password spray and the RDP spray proof of concept. Thanks so much for coming to my talk, guys.